Pose 352. Study Session 6. The Chinese State. Introduction. In this study session, you will examine the formation of the Chinese state. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to outline the formation of the Chinese state, explain the role of the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) in the formation of the Chinese state, recognize the issue of party leadership and its implication for policy, and lastly, analyze the dynamics of the Chinese politics. China at crossroads. The demonstrations had begun in April when university students gathered in Tiananmen, literally Gate of Heavenly Place, to protest widespread official corruption and to demand that the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) allow more democracy in China. The protesters had been emboldened by the fact that under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese people were experiencing more economic and cultural freedom than at any time since the communists had come to power in 1949. The students now wanted to extend the process of reform into the realm of government and politics. Student demands were met with belligerent rhetoric from China's leaders, who denounced the protesters as conspirators and troublemakers intent on overthrowing the CCP. In response to the party's hardline and in the glow of international media attention, the demonstrations grew in size. Citizens from all walks of life in Beijing, teachers, artists and writers, factory and office workers, business owners, retirees, and even government employees came into the street to show their support for students in the square. At one point, more than 1 million people were gathered in and around Tiananmen. Similar protests sprang up in dozens of cities across China. Party intransigence and students' insistence became locked into a deadly spiral of hostility and misunderstanding, and the stakes for both sides in the confrontation escalated to the point where neither would compromise or back down. The students declared a hunger strike. The government declared martial law. The students erected a 30-foot plaster statue of a goddess of democracy, explicitly patterned after the Statue of Liberty. The government became more strident in denouncing foreign subversion as the source of the turmoil. By early June, there were signs that the demonstrations were losing momentum, and it is likely that the crowds would have dispersed on their own accord in a matter of days. But China's communist leaders ran out of patience. The order to move against the students and their supporters, and to do so with deadly force, was made by a handful of elderly party patriarchs, including Deng Xiaoping. Their motive was not just to clear the square and restore order in the city. They wanted to kill the chicken to scare the monkey, an ancient Chinese political control strategy. The massacre was meant to send an unmistakable message throughout China that no challenge to the authority of the Chinese Communist Party would be tolerated, and all necessary means would be used to crush any opposition. How had China reached this point of political crisis in 1989, after more than a decade of tremendous economic progress and soaring hopes under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping? Deng had become China's most powerful leader in 1978 and had almost immediately launched the program of reforms that would fundamentally transform many aspects of the communist regime in China. He had inherited a nation that had been dominated for nearly 3 decades by Mao Zedong, the man who had led the communists to victory in 1949 after a long civil war, presided over the establishment of communist-led political system in China, and pushed the nation along a developmental path shaped by his fervent commitment to a particularly radical version of Marxism-Leninism. Mao has certainly accomplished a great deal in establishing China's independence after more than a century of humiliation and domination by foreign powers and industrializing the country. But the legacy that Mao had bequeathed to Deng Xiaoping was basically one of political repression, social tension, cultural sterility, and economic underachievement. He also left Deng with the stewardship of a ruling communist party that, because of its harsh rule and radicalism, has squandered much of the genuine popularity and support he had enjoyed in the early years in power. Deng's reforms were a profound break with the Maoist past. He introduced policies that reduced the role of the states and increased the role of the markets in the economy. Agriculture was decollectivized and farm production returned to the control of individual families. He sanctioned the rapid expansion of private businesses in both city and countryside. The Chinese economy was open to unprecedented levels of foreign investment. On the cultural front, Chinese artists and writers saw most of the shackles of party dogma that had bound them for decades removed. Tens of thousands of Chinese students were sent abroad with the expectation that they would bring their new knowledge home to serve the nation. Deng took major steps to revitalize China's government by bringing in younger, better educated officials. He promised an end to the bitter and divisive political struggles that had characterized the Maoist period. He proclaimed an era of social harmony in which the whole nation could concentrate its energies on the overarching goals of modernization and economic development. The results of Deng's initiatives were by any measure outstanding. After decades of stagnation, the Chinese economy experienced unprecedented growth. The winds of freedom and openness seemed to be blowing through every sector of life in China. Deng was named Times Magazine's Man of the Year in 1979 and again in 1986 in recognition of both the boldness and the success of his efforts to change China. There had been many warning signs. Deng had often said that the Communist Party and his version of communist doctrine would dictate the boundaries of reform. He had denounced earlier efforts to promote broader democratization in China as a result of spiritual pollution and bourgeoisie liberalization from the West, which would not be permitted to contaminate China's socialist system. He had authorized a crackdown on small-scale democracy movements in 1979 and 1987 and had purged one of his closest associates for being too soft on the issue of political reform. And as a founding leader of the Chinese Communist regime, Deng had been Mao's junior partner in the establishment of one of the world's toughest dictatorships. Tiananmen was a shocking reminder that for all the economic changes that had taken place under Deng, political life in China remains subject to strict regulation by the CCP. Repression has relaxed considerably in the years since Tiananmen massacre. Many political prisoners and dissidents have been released from custody. Cultural restrictions have been loosened again, and people feel much freer to talk. Economic reform is being pursued more vigorously than ever before, with China embracing even more capitalist-like policies and moving even farther from a centrally planned economy and towards the markets. The scenario of Tiananmen still haunts China, however, and a subtle but undeniable veil of terror that dissuades all direct opposition to communist rule still hangs over the country. The People's Republic of China, PRC, is one of only a few countries still governed by a communist party. Its political system reflects the general characteristics of communist party states, including a communist party monopoly on political power, party control of all government and social institutions, and the existence of an official ideology that the party claims the nation must follow if it is to reach its domestic and international goals. The Chinese Communist Party was so dominated in the mid-1990s by a small number of elderly men in their 80s and 90s, including Deng, who turned 90 in 1994, that it was sometimes referred to as a gerontocracy or rule of the elderly. These party elders are desperately attempting to orchestrate the passing of power to younger leaders who share their view that China's development is best served by the combination of a vibrant economy and an authoritarian government. The rift between an oppressive party state and an increasingly assertive society, which led to the shedding of blood in Tiananmen in 1989, remains deep and ominous. How this conflict will be resolved in the years ahead is the biggest issue on China's political agenda. The Chinese Communist Party governs a country that is slightly larger than the United States in land area, making it the second largest nation in the world after Russia. China has by far the largest population, about 1.2 billion in the mid-1990s. Although India may surpass China sometime in the next century if current population growth trends continue in both countries. The PRC now has one of the fastest growing economies in the world, averaging about 10% per year, over the last decade or so. Despite such spectacular economic growth, China is still a developing nation in terms of both the structure of its economy and the economic realities of daily life for the majority of its people. Industrialization and urbanization have expanded significantly in recent years, but about 70% of China's people still live and work in rural areas. The incomes of most Chinese have gone up dramatically since Deng's reform took hold, but they are still very low compared to the average North American, Japanese, or Western European income. By some measures of per capita income, China ranks among the poorest nations of the world, along with countries such as India and Nigeria. By some measures of per capita income, China ranks among the poorest nations of the world, along with countries such as India and Nigeria. However, health and education statistics in China compare favorably with countries that are at much higher level of economic development, such as Brazil and Mexico. This reflects the success of the party states in both the Mao and the Deng eras in addressing some of the most basic needs of the Chinese people. Whether the CCP can manage the economy in a way that continues to yield significant improvements in living standards will also be a major factor in China's political future. The People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, but understanding the formation of the modern Chinese state requires going back much further into China's political history. Broadly considered, that history can be divided into three periods: the imperial or dynastic period 221 BC to AD 1911, the republican period 1912 to 1949, and the communist period 1949 through the present. Durability of Chinese Empire. Several interrelated factors explain the durability of the Chinese Empire. First, Imperial China developed a sophisticated and effective system of national government long before the strong monarchical state of Europe took form in the 17th century. At the pinnacle of this government was an all-powerful emperor and a small group of advisors and ministers in the capital. But the most distinctive feature of the Chinese political tradition was the civil service branch, made up of scholar officials, that is the mandarins, chosen through a rigorous and highly selective examination process. These exams were in theory open to all adult males, but in practice largely accessible only to those who could afford the time and expense of the preparatory education. Although relatively few in number, imperial officials were stationed throughout the country and were the means by which the emperor exercised authority over the vast empire. Second, the traditional Chinese economy was a source of great strength to the empire. Chinese farmers pioneered some of the pre-modern world's most productive agricultural techniques, including irrigation and multi-cropping. Commerce and transport were also highly developed for the times. Although China was and still is a country largely dominated by its rural areas, urbanization expanded in China much sooner and faster than it did in Europe. When Italian traveler and trader Marco Polo journeyed to China in the 13th century, Hangzhou, with a population of over 1 million, was the largest and grandest city in the world. Third, the structure of traditional Chinese society, especially in the million or more small villages that were its foundation, gave the imperial system great staying power. The vast majority of the population was made up of peasants, people who earned their living by working the land. Though some of them were relatively prosperous, most lived a precarious economic existence because of the small size of the average family farm and because they were bound in an exploitative relationship with landlords who were the real source of power on the local level. The most powerful of the landlords' families, the gentry, were those who had close ties to the imperial civil service. Most officials came from the gentry class, and it was the gentry who helped the imperial officials extend their reach down to the very basic level of Chinese society by carrying out many government functions, such as collecting taxes. The strong link between the local gentry and national officials was one of the major ingredients that held the empire together throughout the century. Fourth, Confucianism, which is a social philosophy rather than a religion, provided the core for an official ideology that both legitimized and perpetuated the traditional order. This philosophy was based on the teachings of Confucius 551 to 479 BC and his later disciples and interpreters. It stressed social harmony and righteous behavior, deference to one's elders and superiors, including the subordination of women to men, and the importance of family and education. Confucianism deeply influenced all aspects of life in traditional China and was preached by officials from the throne on down. It informed the content of the exams by which civil servants were chosen. It was a dominant influence in art and literature, and it was the basis of both family life and social organization. The strong cultural identity based on Confucianism also gave the sprawling Chinese empire a pervasive and durable sense of unity. Confucian teachings did contain an injunction, the mandate of heaven, that a ruler could be justifiably overthrown by the people if he did not govern benevolently. And Chinese history is full of rebellions against dynasties that were judged to have lost the heavenly mandate. Nevertheless, Confucianism was basically a conservative orthodoxy that served to justify and maintain an autocratic state, a patriarchal culture, and a stratified society. Finally, the Chinese imperial system endured because, throughout most of its history, China was the dominant force in its known world. Not only was China the overwhelming political and military power in the region, it also gave cultural values to its neighbors, including Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, which incorporated many aspects of Confucianism into their social systems. Foreign influences of peoples that could not be isolated or repelled by the Chinese empire, such as Buddhism from India or invaders from Mongolia, who actually conquered China in 1279, were absorbed or Sinicized by Chinese culture. In other words, they were changed more by China than they were able to change China. The Chinese term for China, Zhonggu, which literally means Middle Kingdom, conveys an image of a country that stands at the moral and cultural center of the world. This belief in the preeminence of China contributed to a pervasive feeling among the Chinese that all non-Chinese were barbarians and that the Middle Kingdom could meet any challenge from outside without having to alter its basic way of life. The end of the empire, we sought powerful forces for preservation. Why did the imperial order start to disintegrate into the mid-19th century? The sources of decline must be traced to unprecedented internal and external challenges that the Chinese empire eventually proved unable to meet. In the 1800s, China was ruled by the Qing dynasty, which was founded in 1644 by Manchus, a non-Chinese ethnic group who had been thoroughly Sinicized after conquering China. Much of Qing rule had been characterized by political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing, both in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The empire experienced an unprecedented population explosion and economic stagnation, along with a significant rise in official corruption, exploitation of peasants by both landlords and the government, and social unrest. Such internal problems would have challenged any government, but the Qing dynasty was further undermined by a fateful change in the Middle Kingdom's relations with the outside world, caused by increased contacts and conflicts between China and the West. The Chinese Empire had had limited encounters with Europe for centuries, but by the end of the 18th century, the West, which by then had soared far ahead of China in terms of industrial development and military technology, began to press China to expand its trade and diplomatic relations. China showed little interest in such overtures and tried to limit the activities of Westerners in China. But Europe, most notably Britain, in the midst of its era of mercantile and colonial expansion, used its military supremacy to compel China to engage in free trade with the West. Qing efforts to stop Britain from selling opium in China to balance the huge British demand for Chinese tea led to military hostilities between the two countries. After suffering humiliating defeats in the Opium War between 1839 to 1842 and other conflicts, China was literally forced to open its borders to foreign merchants, missionaries, and diplomats on terms dictated by Britain and other Western powers. The Middle Kingdom suddenly found itself thrust into a world of states in which its cultural power carried little weight against the superior firepowers of Western cannons, and in which he could no longer control the domestic impact of external forces. Thus, in the second half of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was under siege. Western ideas and peasant misery fed a massive internal revolt, the Taiping Rebellion between 1850 to 1864, which took 20 million lives and nearly toppled the dynasty. China lost control of significant pieces of its territory to foreigners, including Hong Kong, which came under British rule through the unequal treaties imposed on the Chinese through military or diplomatic pressure. Important sectors of the Chinese economy had fallen into foreign hands, and even parts of imperial governments, such as Chinese maritime custom agencies, which controlled much of the country's foreign trade, were run by Westerners. There is considerable debate among scholars about how important Western imperialism was in bringing about the collapse of the Chinese empire, but there is no doubt that the external forces gravely compounded the pressures of the Qing dynasty. Although China was never formally colonized, the circumstances of its entry into the modern world system were hardly conducive to independent national development. There were many efforts to revive or reform the dynasty in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but unlike Japan, where leaders who were committed to modernizing the nation in the face of Western encroachment took control of the country in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Power in China remained largely in the hands of staunch conservatives who resisted change. As a result, when change came, it came in the form of the Revolution of 1911, which not only overthrew the Qing dynasty, but also brought an end to the 2,000-year-old imperial system. The rise of the Chinese Communist Party, the Qing dynasty's fall in 1911, was due more to his own dead weight than to the planned action of revolutionaries. The empire was replaced by the Republic of China, with Sun Yat-sen, then China's best known of revolutionary and founder of his first political party, as president. Sun, a Western-educated doctor, believed that democracy had only limited applicability to China's situation, and that the country would have to go through a period of tutelage in which the people would gradually learn about self-government while concentrating on the main task of national unity and modernization. But the revolution of 1911 can be seen as a culmination of the first stirrings of the democratic idea in China and the first effort to establish a government in which citizens would have its own say. Sun Yat-sen was, however, quickly displaced as president of the Republic by Yuan Shikai, a powerful military leader who tried unsuccessfully to restore the imperial system. After Yuan's death in 1916, China fell into a lengthy period of conflict and disintegration, known as the Warlord Era. Sun's Nationalist Party set about leading another revolution against the warlords who had taken power in the weak and fragmented republic. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) was established by a small group of intellectuals who had become disenchanted with the derailing of the Republican movement and with continued foreign intervention in China's government and economy. They had been inspired by the Bolshevik triumph in Russia in 1917 and by the anti-imperialism of the new Soviet Union to look for more radical solutions to China's most serious problems. In 1924, the small Communist Party, acting on Soviet advice, formed the United Front with Sun Yat-sen, nationalists, with the common purpose of defeating the warlords. After some initial successes, the alliance came to a tragic end in 1927 when Chiang Kai-shek, a military leader who had become the head of the Nationalist Party after Sun's death in 1925, turned against his coalition partners and ordered a bloody suppression that nearly wiped out the communists. Chiang then proceeded to unify the Republic of China under his personal rule, largely by striking an accommodation with some of the country's most powerful remaining warlords. Ironically, the defeat of the CCP created the conditions for the eventual triumph of the man who would lead the party to nationwide victory, Mao Zedong, who had been one of the junior founders of the Communist Party, strongly advocated paying more attention to China's suffering peasants as a potential source of revolutionary support. For more than a decade, China was embroiled in a fierce civil war that pitted communists against nationalists. In Yan'an, the CCP greatly expanded its ranks. Mao consolidated his political and ideological leadership of the Communist Party through sometimes repressive means, and was elected party chairman in 1943, a position that he held until his death in 1976. Mao further developed his ideas about communism and his strategy of guerrilla warfare. He also guided the effort to generate peasant support for the communists through policies such as land reforms and party-led quasi-democratic self-government, in which for the first time peasants were given a direct role in running village affairs. When the civil war resumed in earnest, the communist forces won a decisive and surprisingly quick victory over the US-backed nationalists, as the military acumen of Mao and his generals overwhelmed Chiang Kai-shek's serious battlefield blunders. In the fall of 1949, Chiang and more than 1 million of his supporters fled to the island of Taiwan, 90 miles off the Chinese coast. On October 1 of that year, Mao stood on a rostrum in Tiananmen, near the entrance of the former imperial place in Beijing, and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. Communism in power. Since 1949, there has been a basic stability in Chinese politics in the sense that there has never been any significant challenge to communist power. China's leaders have remained firmly committed to Marxist ideology, and the basic Leninist structure of the political system has remained intact. Such surface continues, however, belies the tremendous political changes that have occurred in China while the CCP has been governing the country. In fact, the history of PRC has been marked by extreme and disruptive political conflicts both between the Chinese party states and its people and within the party itself. These conflicts have produced the dramatic swings in China's domestic and foreign policies that mark the critical junctures in the evolution of the modern Chinese state under communist rule. The most important of these junctures during the Mao era were the 100 Flowers movement between 1956 and 1957, and the Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 1960, and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976. Organization of the Chinese state. Despite many fundamental changes since the Maoist era, party leadership remains an inviolable principle of political life in China in the 1990s. Any analysis of governance and policy making in China must begin with the power of the Communist Party. China is one of the world's few remaining Communist Party states, and the basic organization of the PRC reflects the defining characteristics of this type of political system, including Communist Party domination of all state and social institutions, and the existence of an official and exclusive ideology. Party dominance in the PRC is based on the CCP's claim that as a representative of the best interests of the entire nation, it has the right to exercise the leading role in the state and throughout Chinese society. The party's goal is to promote the building of socialism in China with the ultimate objective of creating a truly egalitarian and classless communist society. The CCP also claims that it has the right to lead the country because of its firm commitment to and superior understanding of communist ideology, which in China is referred to as Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thoughts. The core of this ideology is said to be based on universal truth from the works of the founding fathers of communism, such as Marx's critique of capitalism and his definitions of socialism and communism, and Lenin's theories on party organization and leadership. Mao's contributions to the ideology come from his adaptation of Marxism-Leninism to China's particular historical circumstances, including its economic underdevelopment and largely peasant society. Many, perhaps most people in China, have lost faith in communist ideology because of the Communist Party's erratic and repressive leadership over the last several decades, and there are numerous other sources of beliefs and values in society, such as the family and religion. But Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thoughts still provides the framework for governance and policy making and sets the boundaries for what, in the party's view, is permissible in politics. The underlying political and ideological principles of party-state organization are clearly laid out in China's constitution. The preamble refers explicitly to the leadership of the Communist Party of China and the guidance of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought. Article 1 defines the PRC as a socialist state under the People's Democratic Dictatorship and declares that sabotage of the socialist system by any organization or individual is prohibited. Such provisions implicitly gives the CCP the constitutional authority to exercise dictatorship over those opposed to socialism and the power to decide what kind of political participation is compatible with the country's socialist objectives and communist leadership. The People's Republic of China has had 5 very different governing documents since its founding. A common program for China, adopted in 1949, which guided the early years of the PRC and was based on the new democracy principles of a mixed economy and inclusive politics, and 4 constitutions in 1954, 1975, 1978, and 1982. These documents have only marginally had the force of law. Rather, constitutional change from amendments to total replacement has reflected the shifting political winds in China. The character and content of the governing document in force at any given moment bears the ideological stamp of the prevailing party leadership. For example, in 1993, the current PRC constitution, adopted in 1982, was amended to replace references to the superiority of central planning and state ownership with phrases more consistent with economic reform, including the statement that China practices a socialist market economy. The People's Republic is administratively divided into 22 provinces, 3 centrally administered cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin, and 5 autonomous regions. The autonomous regions are areas of the country in which there is a high concentration of non-Chinese ethnic minorities. The PRC constitution specifies the structures and powers of subnational levels of government, but China is not a federal system like Brazil, Germany, India, Nigeria, and the United States, in which subnational governments have considerable policy-making autonomy. Provincial and local authorities operate under the unified leadership of the central authorities. Article 3, which makes China a unitary state, like Britain, France, and Japan, in which the national government exercises a high degree of control over other levels of government. The Executive. The government of the People's Republic of China is organizationally and functionally distinct from the Chinese Communist Party. For example, the PRC executive consists of both a premier, that is a prime minister, and a president, whereas the CCP is headed by a general secretary. But because there is no alternation of parties in power in China, and because the Communist Party controls government organizations and personnel through various mechanisms described below, it is the top leaders of the CCP, not the government, who hold real executive power when it comes to policy making in China, while the government of the PRC acts as the administrative arm of the party. Nevertheless, to understand fully governance and policy making in China, it is necessary to look at both the Chinese Communist Party and the government of the People's Republic of China. Government of the People's Republic of China. Government authority in China is formally vested in a system of People's Congresses, which begins with the National People's Congress at the top and continues in hierarchically arranged levels down through provincial People's Congresses, municipal People's Congresses, rural township People's Congresses, and so on. In theory, these congresses, the legislative branch, are empowered to supervise the work of the people's government, that is, the executive branch, at the various levels of the system, but in reality, political executives such as cabinet ministers, provisional governors, mayors, and so forth are ultimately subject to party authority rather than to the congresses. Unlike the parallel system of party congresses, the People's Congresses are supposed to represent all of the citizens at the relevant level, not just the minority who are members of the CCP. However, like the party congresses, the People's Congresses play a politically limited but symbolically important role in policy making. The National People's Congress elects the president and vice president of the PRC. The president's term is concurrent with that of the Congress. usually 5 years, and it is limited to 2 consecutive terms. Citizens must be 45 or older to be eligible to serve as president. The position is largely ceremonial, though it has always been held by a senior party leader and has sometimes been used as a base for advancing one's personal power. In 1993, Jiang Zemin, who was also the General Secretary of the CCP, was chosen as president of the PRC. Rong Yiren, a non-communist business leader, was selected as the country's vice president in a gesture that symbolized China's move towards a more market-oriented economy. The premier, who is technically appointed by the president with the approval of the National People's Congress, presides over the actual workings of the government and has considerable authority over the government bureaucracy and in policy making. In fact, the premier is in no way accountable to the president or the Congress and has always been a member of the party standing committee selected to serve in that governmental capacity by the CCP leadership. The premier directs the State Council, constitutionally the highest organ of state administration. The State Council functions like the cabinet in the parliamentary system and is made up of the premier, the vice premiers, the head of government ministries or their equivalents, a secretary general who manages the day-to-day work of the council, an auditor general, the financial administrator, and a few other top officials called state councillors. The size of the state council varies as ministries and commissions are created, merged or disbanded to meet changing policy needs. At times, it has included more than 100 ministerial level officials, but in the early 1990s, it had only about 50 members, reflecting the decreased role of central planning and the administrative streamlining undertaken to make the government more efficient. The ministers and councillors run either functional, specific departments, such as the Ministry of Public Health, organizations with more comprehensive responsibilities, such as the powerful State Economic and Trade Commission. Beneath the State Council and its constituent ministries and commissions are an array of support staff, research offices, and other bureaucratic agencies charged with policy implementation. State administration is based on 2 principles adopted from the Soviet system: vertical rule and the dual rule. Within vertical rule, central level ministries and commissions under the State Council supervise the work of corresponding functional bodies at the lower level of government. Within the dual rule, government agencies are subject to control by the Communist Party as well as being subordinate to higher government bodies under vertical and dual rule. A country government, for example, would be subordinate to both the provincial government and to the country-level Communist Party organization. Such a system leads to complex and sometimes conflicting lines of authority within the Chinese bureaucracy, but it also reinforces 2 key aspects of governance and policy making in China: centralization and party domination. As the role of central planning has been reduced and more power has been given to provincial and local authorities, particularly in economic matters, efforts have also been made to reduce party, that is, political party interference in administrative work. For example, the top party leader in a province, that is the secretary, is no longer allowed to serve simultaneously as the province's governor, its chief administrator. Nevertheless, China's bureaucracy remains a top-down system subordinate to the power of the CCP. China's bureaucracy is immense in size and expansive in the scope of its reach throughout the country. The total number of cadres, that is, people in positions of authority who are paid by the state or party in the PRC, is in the range of 30 million. Of these, about 5 million are government officials. The remainder have authority in economic enterprises, schools, political, scientific, cultural, and other state-run institutions and party organizations. Not all party members are cadres. In fact, most party members are just ordinary workers and farmers, and not all cadres are party members, though party cadres ultimately have power over non-party cadres. During the Maoist years, cadre recruitment and promotion standards often gave strong preference to people with good ideological credentials. that's the Reds, over those who may have been more professionally qualified, that is the experts, which seriously compromise the ability of the bureaucracy to do its job well. The balance has now clearly shifted to the experts, and there is much greater emphasis on having better catered and more technically proficient personnel staffing the government's bureaucracy. Economic reform has made a technocrat ally-oriented bureaucracy an essential part of the policy process in China. Subnational government. There are several layers of state structure beneath the central government in China, including provinces, prefectures, cities, districts, counties, and rural towns, all of which are referred to as local in China's constitution. As noted above, each of these levels has a People's Congress that is subordinate to higher level authorities. Like the National People's Congress, these local congresses meet infrequently and briefly, though the standing committees of provincial and county level congresses are somewhat more active in managing local affairs. Day-to-day administrations at each subnational level is carried out by a local people's government, which consists of an executive leader, for instance, a provincial governor, county head, or city mayor. Various functional bureaus such as education and industry, and judicial and procuratorial organs. According to China's constitution, the work of local government is supervised by the local People's Congress. But in fact, the principles of vertical and dual roles discussed above make local officials more accountable to higher levels of state administration and to party organizations than to the local congresses. Deng's reforms have led to a decentralization of decision-making to lower levels of China's political system, as provinces, cities, counties, and towns are now encouraged to take more initiative in promoting economic development in their area. As a result, local governments are becoming increasingly vigorous in pursuing their own interests. Nevertheless, the central government still retains the power to intervene in local affairs when and where it wants. This power of the central authorities derives not only from their ability to set binding national economic priorities, but also their control over such things as the military and the police, critical energy sources, and the constitution of major infrastructural projects. Beneath the former layers of state administrations are China's 800,000 plus rural villages that are home to the vast majority of the country's population. These villages are technically self-governing and are not formally responsible to a higher level of state authority. In reality, however, village autonomy is very limited. In recent years, village leaders and village representative assemblies have been directly elected by local residents. Despite these democratizing trends, power in most Chinese villages tend to be highly personalistic and concentrated in a single individual, the village head, who is most often also the secretary or leader of the village communist party. The rural reforms described in section 2 have given many villages more resources and more autonomy than they had under the Maoist communist system. But the reform have also strengthened the role of the village head, party secretary, who is often also the village's leading entrepreneur in establishing and managing the rural industries on which many areas now base their governing prosperity. Chinese Communist Party. The major organizational principle of the CCP is democratic centralism, a concept developed by Lenin in the early part of this century to ensure discipline, unity, and accountability in the communist movement during the Russian Revolution. The democratic component of the concept is supposed to allow for the expression of individual views and for rank and file input into leadership decisions, including the right of lower levels to elect officials at higher levels. The term centralism implies that lower levels of the party are subordinate to higher levels and individual members are subordinate to the organization. In Lenin's time, there was some vitality to the democratic part of the principle. But from Stalin on, centralism prevailed and intensified in the Soviet and other communist parties, including the CCP. The practice of democratic centralism created a pseudo-military command structure in the CCP, with authority following from the top down, and in which a higher authority could always encroach upon the jurisdiction of the lower level. In other words, there is a lot more centralism than there is democracy. The CCP is organized into several geographical layers that reach from the center of power at the national level down to local party organizations, a catch-all term that includes provinces, cities, and counties, and finally down to more than 3 million primary party organizations called branches and cells, which are found in workplaces, schools, urban centers, rural towns, villages, and army units. This structure, which extends party control throughout Chinese society, is highly centralized and hierarchical, and is designed to ensure the subordination of each level of party organization to the next higher level and to the central party authorities. Military. The military has never held formal political power in the PRC, but it has in many ways and at many times been a very important influence on politics and policy. Ever since the days of the Revolution and the Civil War, close ties have existed between the political and military leaders of the CCP, with many top leaders such as Mao and Deng serving both political and military capacities. One of the most famous quotes from Chairman Mao's writings, "Political power grows out of the barrel of the gun," conveyed his belief that the party needed strong military backing in order to win and keep power. However, the often overlooked second half of the quote, "Our principle is that the party commands the gun and the gun must never be allowed to command the party," made the equally important point that the military had to be kept under civilian, that is CCP control. Although there have been a few periods when the role of the military in Chinese politics appeared to be particularly strong and people speculated about the possibility of a coup d'etat, the party has always been able to keep the gun under its firm command. In 1968, Mao ordered the army to stop Red Guard fighting and restore political order. The PLA subsequently filled the political vacuum during a period of paralysis in most states and party organizations, and for a time, military offices were highly visible in the national, provincial, and local governments. The military political role ended when Lin Biao died in 1971, supposedly in a plane crash while attempting to flee China, following an abortive attempt to overthrow Mao. It is certain that Mao and Lin had a serious falling out that resulted in the death of Lin, a purge of his followers, and a retreat of the military from direct involvement in politics. China's communist leaders have long been divided over the issue of what kind of armed forces the People's Republic of China needed. Mao was a strong advocate of equality between rank and file soldiers and officers, the use of guerrilla tactics, people's war, even in the modern warfare, the importance of ideological education within the military, of the extensive use of the PLA in non-military tasks, such as the construction of public works, projects, and the training of citizens, paramedics. Some of China's foremost military leaders believed, just as strongly, that the PLA ought to emphasize the discipline, professionalism, and modernization needed to defend the nation. Under Deng Xiaoping, the military leadership has been able to keep politics and ideology in the armed forces to a minimum and focus on making the PLA an effective modern fighting force. China's People's Liberation Army is the world's largest military force, with millions of active personnel. The PLA also has a formal reserve of another million or so and a backup People's Militia of around 12 million, which could be mobilized in the event of war, although the level of training and weaponry available to the militia is generally minimal. Despite the large size of the PLA, the Chinese military is in fact small in relation to China's total population. In recent years, the PLA has climbed on to the economic reform bandwagon in order to supplement its official budget by converting the number of its military factories over to the production of consumer goods such as refrigerators and motorcycles, running hotels, and even discos, and opening up some of its previously secret facilities to foreign tourists in order to earn funds to supplement the formal defense budget. In the mid-1990s, it was estimated that the PLA ran more than 20,000 non-military enterprises with 2.5 million workers. China exploded its first atomic bomb in 1964 and has continued weapon development and above-ground testing since then. Its current nuclear stockpile is relatively small, 450 strategic and tactical warheads, compared to 29,000 in Russia and 15,000 in the United States. And its long and medium-range delivery capabilities are quite limited. Nevertheless, the PRC is a formidable regional military power, and some of its neighbors are worried about the possibility of China expansionism, especially if the government tries to use strident nationalism to supplement Marxism-Leninism as the country's unifying ideology. A potential hotspot in the region is the South China Sea, where the PRC claims a historical right to the Spratlys, a chain of hundreds of uninhabited islands and reefs that lie close to or even within the territorial waters of Vietnam, the Philippines, and several other Southeast Asian states. Already, there have been several small-scale military skirmishes between China and Vietnam in the South China Sea, and the dispute could escalate given the rich undersea oil and mineral deposits and fertile fishing grounds in the area. Policy-making process. At the height of Mao's power, many analysts describe the policy process in China as a Mao in command system, in which the chairman and a few of his close lieutenants made the most important decisions and passed them along to be implemented by obedient party and government cadres. The Cultural Revolution led many scholars to conclude that policy outcomes in China were best understood as a result of factional and ideological struggles within the Chinese political elite. More recently, emphasis has shifted to analyzing the centrality of bureaucratic actors and institutions in the policy process, and especially the ways in which subordinate bureaucratic units charged with implementing policy reshape the policies made by their superiors. Policy making is still seen as highly authoritarian, but rather than portraying it as simply as a matter of the party issuing orders from the top, this model of fragmented authoritarianism sees power as being dispersed among many bureaucratic agencies, and policy outcomes are resulting from a process of conflict, competition, and bargaining among party and state organizations. Nevertheless, ultimate power in the Chinese political system, and therefore control of policy process at all levels, belongs to the Chinese Communist Party. In China, the formal division of political labor is one in which the Communist Party makes policy and the government, the bureaucracy, headed by the Premier and the State Council, implements it. This is superficially similar to other types of political system where the political party in power controls policy making and the bureaucracy carries out the policy decisions made by the governing party. For example, when the Conservatives are in power in Britain or the Liberal Democrats are in power in Japan, they control the cabinet, which decides important policy matters, which in turn are implemented by the administrative arm of government, the civil service. Of course, the critical distinction in the case of China is that there are no opposition parties that have any chance of taking office, so the political power that undergirds policy making remains the exclusive monopoly of a single political party, the CCP. Formal laws in China are enacted by government bodies like the State Council and the National People's Congress, but the policies behind those laws are made only by the Communist Party. Furthermore, public debates, media scrutiny, and the influence of organized interest groups play almost no role in the policy process in the Chinese party state. Like all the ruling communist parties, past and present, the CCP uses the web-like system of controls to supervise the government and to ensure that the bureaucracy remains compliant to the party's will in the policy process. Some of these control mechanisms, such as the fact that most key government leaders are also likely to be high-ranking members of the communist parties, have already been mentioned. The CCP also exercises control over policy implementation through a variety of parallel and supervisory structures that oversee the work of government officials at every level of the political system. For instance, provisional governors work under the watchful eyes of provisional party secretaries, and the leading group on finance and economy is just one of the numerous national-level party organizations with authority that cuts across many government ministries. The CCP also maintains an effective presence inside every government organization, including ministries and bureaus, people's congresses, schools, state enterprises, military units, and so on. These organizations have a party branch or cell, which is made up of all the CCP members who work in that organization, and a party committee headed by a party secretary, who is usually the real source of authority, even when technically outranked in that organization by a non-party official. For example, Beijing University, China's premier institution of higher education, has both a president, who is the school's chief administrative and academic officer, and a party secretary, who is ultimately the most powerful person at the university. Some high-level government organizations also have a very powerful party core group, made up of 3 to 5 CCP members, who also hold particularly important positions in the organization. Finally, the CCP uses a cadre list, or as it was known in the Soviet Union, where the practice originated, the nomenclatura system, to control the careers of millions of officials in the government and elsewhere, including, among others, newspapers, hospitals, banks, and trade unions. Any personnel decision involving appointment, promotion, transfer, or dismissal that affects a position on this extensive list must be approved by the party's organization department, whether or not the official involved is a party member. In recent years, the growth of non-state sectors of the economy and administrative streamlining designed to improve efficiency have led to a reduction in the number of non-party positions directly subject to party approval. Nevertheless, the nomenclatura list is still one of the major instruments by which the CCP tries to ensure that leading institutions throughout the country will exercise only the autonomy granted to them by the party. Through these various mechanisms of political domination, the Chinese Communist Party has not only controlled the government with a tight, constant political control, it actually substituted itself for the government in administering the state. In recent years, there has been much talk about drawing a sharper distinction between party and government functions and bringing more non-party experts into the policy loop. And while some limited action has been taken, party domination and control remain the most salient features of the policy process in China. Finally, no account of policy making or implementation in China is complete without noting the importance of the connections, the personal relationships, and mutual obligations based on family, friendship, and school, military, professionals, or other ties. The notion of the connection has its roots in Confucianism and has long been an important part of political, social, and economic life in China. One would expect that the communists would have curtailed such a traditional practice after they came to power in 1949, but on the contrary, instead of declining its importance, these connections have increased as Chinese have experienced all the unsettling effects of revolution and social change over the last several decades. Guanxi counts mightily in the highly personalized world of elite politics within the CCP, where policy is made. There are also basic facts of life within the Chinese bureaucracy, where personal ties are often the key to getting things done, depending on how they are used. Guanxi can either help cut red tape and increase efficiency or bolster organizational rigidity and feed corruption. In sum, Communist parties are at the heart of the policy process in China. Party domination, however, does not mean that politics operate in a monolithic way. In fact, the system wrestles with politics of many kinds, formal and informal. In order to get a complete picture of policymaking in China, one must look at how various influences, including bureaucratic interests, personal connections, ideological differences, factional conflicts, and social pressures shape the decision made by the Communist Party leadership. Judicial system. The judicial system of the PRC came under severe attack as a bastion of elitism and revisionism during the Cultural Revolution. The formal legal system pretty much ceased to operate during that period, and many of its functions were taken over by political or police organizations, which often acted arbitrarily in making arrests or administering punishments. In recent years, China's legal system has been revitalized. Tens of thousands of judges and lawyers have been trained. Some have even been sent abroad for legal education, and legal advisory offices have been established throughout the country to provide citizens and organizations with advice and assistance in dealing with the courts. Many laws and regulations have been enacted, including new criminal and civil codes, in the effort to regularize the legal system. China has a four-tiered People's Court system, reaching from a Supreme People's Court at the top down through higher, intermediate, and basic People's Courts located at the various administrative levels of the state. The Supreme People's Court supervises the work of lower courts and the application of the country's laws, but it hears few cases and does not exercise judicial review over government policies. A nationwide organization called the People's Procuratorate serves in the courts as both public prosecutor and public defender, and also has investigatory functions in criminal cases. Citizen mediation committees based in urban neighborhoods and rural villages also play an important role in the judicial process by settling a large majority of civil cases out of court. In the day-to-day application of the law, the legal system can render justice for ordinary citizens who do not trust in the authority of the state. The courts provide a practical avenue of redress for a wide range of non-political citizens' grievances and have been extensively used to punish corrupt or abusive officials. The criminal justice system works swiftly and harshly. Great faith is placed in the ability of an official investigation to find the facts of a case, and the outcome of cases that actually do come to trial is pretty much predetermined. Out of more than 2 million criminal cases tried in 1988 to 1993, only 0.4% were found not guilty. Prison terms for those convicted are long and subject only to cursory appeal. A variety of offences, in addition to murdering, in some cases rape, and particularly serious cases of embezzlement and other economic crimes, are subject to capital punishment, which is carried out within days of sentencing. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people have been executed during the periodic government-sponsored anti-crime campaigns, and China has been harshly criticized by human rights organizations such as Amnesty International for its extensive use of the death penalty. Although the PRC constitution speaks of judicial and procuratorial independence, China's courts and other legal bodies remain under rigorous party control. The appointment of judicial personnel is subject to party approval, and the CCP can and does bend the law to serve its interests. Following the Tiananmen massacre, arbitrary arrests and detentions, beatings of prisoners, and secret trials were used as part of the crackdown against political dissidents, and legal officials who were considered too sympathetic to the pro-democracy movement were removed from their position. Recent legal reforms in China have not been designed to create a truly independent judiciary. They have been undertaken because the party knows that economic development requires detailed laws, professional judicial personnel, predictable legal processes, and binding documents such as contracts. Like other government institutions in the PRC, the judicial system's basic purpose is to serve as an instrument of party rule. The scope of legality, the areas of society regulated by the legal system, rather than the whims of officials or personal connections, has undoubtedly widened in China in the Deng era. But all in all, the political system of the PRC in the 1990s is still one where the rule of the individual leaders and of the community party prevails over the rule of the law. Study session summary. In this study session, we focused on CCP, and we noted that it was established in 1949 after the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. Unitary system with 22 provinces, 5 autonomous regions, and 3 centralized administered municipalities. But we notice that the premier, that is the head of government, and the president, that is the head of state, formally elected by legislature, but only with approval of CCP leadership. The head of the CCP, the general secretary, is the country's effective chief executive. Also, unicameral National People's Congress delegates elected indirectly from lower level People's Congresses for 5-year terms, largely a rubber stamp for Communist Party policies, although in recent years has become somewhat more assertive. A nationwide system of people's courts, which is constitutionally independent but is in fact largely under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. A Supreme People's Court supervises the country's judicial system and is formally responsible to the National People's Congress, which also elects the court's president, a one-party system, although in addition to the ruling Chinese Communist Party, there are 8 politically insignificant democratic parties. End of study session 6. Thank you for listening.